Alright, here we go. Next chapter of the BFG. The Blood Bottler. Suddenly, a tremendous thumping noise came from outside the cave entrance, and a voice like thunder shouted, "Runt! You in there? Runt! I is hearing you jabbling. Who is you jabbling to, Runt?" "Look out!" cried the BFG. "It's the Blood Bottler." But before he had finished speaking, the stone was rolled aside, and a 50-foot giant, more than twice as tall as wide as the BFG, came striding into the cave. He was naked except for a dirty little piece of cloth around his bottom. Sophie was on the tabletop. The enormous, partly eaten Snozcumber was lying near her. She ducked, be- she ducked behind it. The creature came clumping into the cave and stood towering over the BFG. "Who was you jabbling to here just now?" he boomed. "I is jabbling to myself," the BFG answered. "Piz fizzle," shouted the Blood Bottler. "Bugs wallop," he boomed. "You is talking to a human being. That's what I is thinking." "No, no," cried the BFG. "Yes, yes," boomed the Blood Bottler. "I is guessing you has snatched away a human being and brought it back to your bunghole as a pet. So now I is winkling it out and guzzling it as extra snacks before my supper." The poor BFG was very nervous. "There's no one here," he stammered. "Why don't you leave me alone?" The Blood Bottler pointed a finger at a large tree trunk at the BFG. "Runny little lut scum schooler," he shouted. "Piffling little squig figgler, squimpy little bottlewort, prudy little pug squeller, I is now going to search the primroses." He grabbed the BFG by the arm. "And you is going to help me do it. Us together is going to winkle out this little tasty human being," he shouted. The BFG had intended to whisk Sophie off the table as soon as he got the chance and hide her behind his back. But now there was no hope of doing this. Sophie peered around the chewed-off end of the enormous Snozcumber, watching the two giants as they moved away down the cave. The Blood Bottler was a gruesome sight. His skin was reddish-brown. There was black hair spouting from his chest and arms, and on his stomach. The hair on his head was long and dark and tangled. His foul face was round and squishy-looking. The eyes were tiny black holes. The nose was small and flat, but the mouth was huge. It spread right across the face, almost from ear to ear. And it had lips that were like two gigantic purple frankfurters, lying one on top of the other. Craggly yellow teeth stuck out between the two purple frankfurter lips, and rivers of spit ran down his chin. It was not in the least difficult to believe that this ghastly brute ate men, women, and children every night. The Blood Bottler, still holding the BFG by the arm, was examining the rows and rows of bottles. "You and your pibbling bottles," he shouted. "What did you putting in them?" "Nothing that would interest you," the BFG answered. "You was only interested in guzzling human beings. And you as dotty as a dog waddler," cried the Blood Bottler. Soon the Blood Bottler would be coming back, Sophie told herself, and he was bound to search the tabletop. But she couldn't possibly jump off the table. It was 12 feet high. She would break a leg. The Snozcumber, although it was as thick as a perambulator, was not going to hide her if the Blood Bottler picked it up. She examined the chewed-off end. It had large seeds in the middle, each one as big as a melon. They were embedded in soft, slimy stuff. Taking care to stay out of sight, Sophie reached forward and scooped away half a dozen of those seeds. This left a little hole in the middle of the Snozcumber, large enough for her to crawl in. She crawled into it. It was wet and slimy, but what did it matter if it was going to save her from being eaten? The Blood Bottler and BFG were coming back toward the end of the table. The BFG was nearly fainting with fear. Any moment, he was telling himself, Sophie would be discovered and eaten. Suddenly, the Blood Bottler grabbed the half-eaten Snozcumber. The BFG stared at the bare table. "Sophie, where is you?" he thought desperately. "You cannot possibly be jumping off that table. So where is you hiding, Sophie? So this is the filthy, rotten glubberage you is eating. You must be cockled to be guzzling such rub squash." For a moment the Blood Bottler seemed to have forgotten about searching for Sophie. The BFG decided to lead him further off the track. "That is a scrumdiddlyumptious Snozcumber," he said. "I is guzzling it gleefully every night and day. If you ever is trying a Snozzcumber blood bottler, human beings is juicier, the blood bottler said. You is taking rummy tot, the BFG said, growing braver by the second. He was thinking that if only he could get the blood bottler to take one bite of the repulsive vegetable, the sheer foulness of its flavor would send him bellowing out of the cave. I is happy to let you sample it, the BFG went on, but please, when you see how truly glumptious it is, do not be guzzling the whole thing. Leave me a little snitchet for my supper. The blood bottler stared suspiciously with small piggy eyes at the Snozzcumber. Sophie, crouching inside, chewed off the end, began to tremble all over. You is not switch-fiddling me, is you? Said the blood bottler. Never, cried the BFG passionately. Take a bite, and I'm positive you'll be shouting out how scrumdiddly-umptious this Wonderveg is. The BFG could see the greedy blood bottler's mouth beginning to water more than ever at the prospect of extra food. Vegetables is very good for you, he went on. It is not healthsome to always be eating meaty things. Just this once, the blood bottler said, I was going to give it a rotsome eats of yours. But I is warning you that if it is filthsome, I am smashing it over your sludgy little head. He picked up the Snozzcumber. He began raising it long on its journey to his mouth, some 50 feet up in the air. Sophie wanted to scream, "Don't!" But that would have been even more certain death. Crouching among the slimy seeds, she felt herself being lifted up and up. Suddenly there was a crunch, and the blood bottler bit a huge chunk off the end. Sophie saw his yellow teeth clumping together, a few inches from her head. Then there was utter darkness. She was in his mouth. She caught a whiff of his evil-smelling breath. It stank of bad meat. She waited for the teeth to go crunch once more. She prayed she would be killed quickly. "Ouch!" roared the blood bottler. "Ugh, belch!" And then he spat. All of the great lumps of Snozzcumber that were in his mouth, as well as Sophie, went shooting out across the cave. If Sophie had struck the stony wall of the cave, she would most certainly have been killed. Instead, she hit the soft fold of the BFG's black cloak, hanging against the wall. She dropped into the ground, half stunned. She crawled under the hem of the cloak, and there she crouched. "You little swine bugler," roared the blood bottler. "You little pig's whittler." He rushed to the BFG and smashed what was left of the Snozzcumber over his head. Fragments of the filthy vegetable splashed all over the cave. "You is not loving it?" the BFG asked innocently, rubbing his head. "Loving it?" yelled the blood bottler. "This is the most disgustorous taste that has ever touched my teeth. You must be buggles to be swallowing sludge like that. Every night you could be galloping me off half as a hamburger and gobbling up juicy human beings." "Eating human beings is evil and wrong," the BFG shouted. "It is guzzly and glumptious," shouted the blood bottler, "and tonight I is galloping off to Chile to swabble a few chili beans. If you is wishing to know why I is choosing Chile, I is not wishing to know anything," the BFG said. "I is choosing Chile," the blood bottler said, "because I is fed up with the taste of Eskimos. It is important that I has plenty of cold eats in this skittily hot weather, and the next coldest thing to an Eskimo is a chili bean. Human beans from Chile is very chilly." "Horrible," the BFG said. "You ought to be ashamed." "Other giants is all saying they is wanting to gallop off to England tonight to guzzle school children's," the blood bottler said. "I is very fond indeed of English school childers. They has a very nice inky booky flavor. Perhaps I will change my mind and go to England with them." "You is disgusting," the BFG said. "And you is an insult to giant peoples," shouted the blood bottler. "You is not fit to be a giant. You is a squinky little squiddler. You is pibbling little pipsqueak. You is a cream puff nut." With all that horrible blood bottling, Giant strode out of the cave. The BFG ran to the cave entrance and quickly rolled the stone back into place. "Sophie," he whispered. "Sophie, where is you? Sophie?" Sophie emerged from under the hem of the black cloak. "I am here," she said. The BFG picked her up and held her tenderly in the palm of his hand. "Oh, I am so happy to be finding you all in one lump," he said. "I was in his mouth," Sophie said. "You was what?" cried the BFG. Sophie told him what happened. And there I was, telling him to eat the filthy snozzcumber, and you was all the time inside it, the BFG cried. Not much fun, said Sophie. Just look at you, you poor little chiddler, cried the BFG. You was all covered in snozzcumber and giant spit. He sent out about cleaning her up. I is hating those other giants more than ever, he said. You know what I should like? What, said Sophie. I should like to find a way of dispersing them, or disappearing them, every single one. I'll be glad to help you, said Sophie. Let me see if I can't think of a way of doing it.